Have you ever felt the sting of rejection so sharp it stole the very air from your lungs? Imagine traveling 1,000 miles, your heart filled with dreams of a new life, only to be turned away on a dusty street with nowhere to go. This isn't just a story of heartbreak. It's the story of Aria Wren, a mail-order bride cast aside by the wealthiest, most broken man in the Montana Territory, Soren Blackwood. But what started with a humiliating rejection and a shocking, impulsive hug in front of the entire town would unravel a dark web of secrets, greed, and a long-buried tragedy that would leave every soul in Redemption Gulch weeping in the dust. The stagecoach rattled into Redemption Gulch like a dying beast kicking up a plume of ochre dust that settled on everything, including the last vestiges of Aria Wren's hope. For 3 weeks, she had been folded into its cramped, musty interior, her body aching. Her savings depleted to a few meager coins, all for a promise contained in a single letter. A promise of a home, a future, and a husband named Soren Blackwood. The photograph she clutched in her worn reticule had shown a man with kind eyes, though they were tinged with a sadness she felt she could soothe. The letter, penned not by him, but by his sister, spoke of a vast ranch, a good man in need of a wife's gentle touch and a life of security, far from the destitution she was fleeing in St. Louis. As she stepped out onto the main street, the town of Redemption Gulch seemed to hold its breath. Doors creaked open. Faces peered from behind lace curtains. She was an event, a spectacle. Her dress, though her finest, was travel-worn and limp. Her bonnet felt foolish under the immense, unforgiving sky. She saw him immediately. He stood before the land office, a titan of a man whose broad shoulders seemed to carry the weight of the world. Soren Blackwood was more imposing in person than in the photograph, his face a rugged landscape of sun-weathered lines and a jaw set like granite. But the kindness she had imagined in his eyes was gone, replaced by a storm cloud of raw, unguarded grief. He wasn't just sad. He was hollowed out. "Mr. Blackwood," she asked, her voice a fragile tremor. He turned, and his gaze swept over her, not with the curiosity of a prospective groom, but with the flat, dismissive disinterest of a man looking at a stray dog. "Who's askin' I am Aria Wren, from St. Louis." She held out the letter, her hand shaking. "Your sister, Martha. She arranged." Soren's face darkened, the storm clouds converging into a thunderhead. He didn't even glance at the letter. "Martha." He spoke the name as if it were a curse. "My sister is a meddling fool who lives 1,000 miles away and knows nothing of my affairs. I did not send for you. I do not want a wife." The words were like saps to the face, each one sharper than the last. The townsfolk who had been pretending not to watch were now openly staring, their whispers buzzing like flies. Humiliation, hot and suffocating, washed over Aria. She had gambled everything on this. There was no money for a return ticket, no family to go back to. This dusty, indifferent street was now the end of the line. "But," the letter promised, she stammered, her voice cracking. "I have nowhere to go. That is not my concern." Soren said, his voice a low growl of finality. He turned his back on her, a gesture of absolute dismissal that broke something deep inside her. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her shame. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the harsh lines of the town. She saw his broad back, the rigid set of his shoulders, and in that moment, she didn't see a cruel man. She saw a man drowning in a pain so vast he had no room for anyone else. The kind eyes from the photograph were still there, she realized, just buried under layers of unspeakable sorrow. What she did next, she could never explain. It was not a calculated move or a plea for pity. It was a purely impulsive act of human connection, a desperate reach for the wounded soul she saw beneath the calloused exterior. Before he could take a step, she closed the distance between them. Her arms, trembling but resolute, wrapped around his waist from behind. She pressed her cheek against the rough fabric of his shirt, and for a fleeting second she felt the rigid wall of his muscles. She held on, not like a lover, but like someone holding a shattered vessel together. The entire street went silent. A gasp rippled through the onlookers. Even the wind seemed to die down. Soren froze his body, going as still and hard as petrified wood. No one had touched him with such tenderness since the fire, since he'd lost everything. The unexpected embrace was a profound shock to his system, a violation of the sacred empty space he had built around himself. "Get your hands off me," he snarled, his voice thick with a mixture of rage and something else. Fear. He wrenched himself away, spinning around to face her. His eyes, now blazing with a cornered fury, met hers. Her own tears were now streaming freely down her face, born not of self-pity, but of a sudden, overwhelming empathy for this broken stranger. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. You looked so alone." Her words, meant as a comfort, were the worst possible thing she could have said. They struck the very heart of his private agony, the truth he fought to keep buried every single day. "You know nothing about me," he seethed, taking a menacing step toward her. From the corner of his eye, he saw Sheriff Jedediah Kane, watching from the porch of his office, a smirk playing on his thin lips. Kane reveled in the weakness of others, and Soren had just been made to look weak. It was intolerable. He pointed a trembling finger at Arya, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Get out of my town. I don't want to see your face again." He turned on his heel and strode toward his horse, his movements stiff and furious. He swung into the saddle and galloped out of town, leaving Arya standing alone in a cloud of dust and shattered dreams, the echo of his cruelty hanging in the air, and the memory of her hug burning like a brand on his skin. The whole town had witnessed her rejection. But in that strange, desperate moment of connection, a seed had been planted, one that would either be crushed under the weight of tragedy or grow into something that could save them both. The dust Soren Blackwood had kicked up settled, but the cloud of public humiliation clung to Arya like a shroud. She stood frozen, the focal point of every pitying, scornful, and curious gaze in Redemption Gulch. Her grand arrival had devolved into a pathetic spectacle. She was the rejected mail-order bride, a cautionary tale whispered over saloon tables and sewing circles before she had even learned the name of the town's main street. Just as she was about to be swallowed whole by despair, a gentle voice cut through the murmuring crowd. Miss Wren Arya turned to see a small, wiry man with a kind, wrinkled face and spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He was wiping his hands on a white apron. "I am Arthur Abernathy," he said, his voice soft. "I own the general store." That was an unfortunate welcome. Arya could only nod the lump in her throat, too large to speak around. Soren Blackwood. He wasn't always like that. Mr. Abernathy continued, his eyes full of a sorrow that seemed to extend beyond her immediate plight. The fire changed him. Took his wife, Sarah, and their little boy, Daniel. It's been 2 years, but for him, I reckon it feels like yesterday. The revelation landed with quiet force. It didn't excuse Soren's cruelty, but it framed it in the stark, jagged light of tragedy. The hollow emptiness in his eyes suddenly had a name. "I'm sorry to hear that," she whispered, her own problems feeling momentarily smaller. "Still, it was no way to treat you," Mr. Abernathy said firmly. He looked at her worn dress and the desperation in her eyes. "You said you have nowhere to go." She shook her head, the motion dislodging a fresh tear that traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. "Nonsense," he declared with a surprising amount of authority. "I have a small room above the store. It's not much, but it's clean and warm, and I could use some help keeping the shelves stocked and the accounts in order. It would be a loan of a sort. You can work to pay for your keep and save for a ticket back east if that's what you decide." The offer was a lifeline thrown into a churning sea of hopelessness. Gratitude so immense it was painful swelled in Arya's chest. I don't know what to say." "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy." "Thank you." "Think nothing of it, my dear," he said with a warm smile. "It's the least a good Christian can do. Let's get your things." As Mr. Abernathy led her away from the gawking crowd, Arya caught the eye of Sheriff Jedediah Kane. He was still lounging on his porch, but the smirk had been replaced by a look of calculating assessment. His gaze lingered on her cold and unnerving, as if he were measuring her, trying to determine her value or her potential use. A shiver traced its way down her spine. There was no kindness in that man's eyes, only ambition. The room above the store was small and simple, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the main street. To Arya, it felt like a palace. She spent the next few days in a flurry of work, grateful for the distraction. She learned to weigh flour stack tins and decipher Mr. Abernathy's scrawled inventory notes. She was a quick study, and the old man was clearly pleased with her diligence. The work gave her a purpose and a vantage point from which to observe the rhythms of Redemption Gulch. She saw the ranchers come in for supplies, their talk a constant stream of concerns about water rights, cattle prices, and the encroaching shadow of the railroad. She saw the wives, their conversations, a tapestry of gossip recipes and quiet worries. And she saw Sheriff Kane. He moved through the town with an air of unassailable authority, his hand resting casually on the colt at his hip. People were deferential to him, but it was a deference born of fear, not respect. A week after her arrival, she had her second encounter with Soren Blackwood. He came into the store for a sack of grain and a side of bacon, his presence sucking the warmth from the room. He pointedly ignored her directing his requests to Mr. Abernathy. As Mr. Abernathy went into the back room to fetch the bacon, Soren stood by the counter, his back to her, a wall of silent, brooding anger. Arya's heart hammered against her ribs. She should stay quiet, make herself invisible. But something, the same stubborn, inexplicable impulse that had made her hug him, refused to let her. "The sorghum molasses came in this morning," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Mr. Abernathy said you were asking after it last month." Soren flinched, as if she had struck him. He turned his head slowly. His eyes narrowed. "I was talking to him. He's in the back." "I'm standing right here," she retorted, a spark of defiance igniting within her. She would not be treated like a piece of furniture. "It's good quality. From New Orleans." A flicker of surprise or perhaps grudging respect crossed his face before he shuttered it away. I'll take a jar." She retrieved the jar and placed it on the counter with a firm clink. Their fingers brushed as he reached for it, and a jolt like static electricity passed between them. He recoiled as if burned. Mr. Abernathy returned with the bacon, sensing the thick tension in the air. "Everything all right here?" "Fine," Soren grunted, avoiding both their gazes. He paid for his items in coins, not even looking up as he counted them onto the counter, and left without another word. Mr. Abernathy sighed. "That's the most I've heard him say in a month." The small interaction left Arya unsettled. The brief touch had confirmed what her intuition had told her. Beneath the ice there was fire. His pain was a living, breathing thing. Her life settled into a routine, but her mind was anything but settled. She learned more about the town's dynamics. The Blackwood Ranch, the Triple B, was the largest and most prosperous in the territory. Soren, for all his reclusiveness, was a shrewd rancher. His success bred envy, and several smaller ranchers, particularly a man named Phineas Cobb, were openly hostile toward him. But it was Sheriff Kane who truly troubled her. He made a point of stopping by the store whenever she was working alone. He'd lean against the counter, his smile oily and his questions probing. "A shame what happened with Blackwood," he said one afternoon, his voice oozing false sympathy. "A man like that with all that land, he doesn't deserve a fine woman like you." "I'm fine," Sheriff Arya replied coolly, busying herself with dusting a shelf. "He's unstable, you know." Kane continued undeterred. "Ever since the fire. Folks say he's half mad with grief. A man like that, sitting on so much wealth. It's a dangerous combination. One has to wonder if he's fit to manage it all." The insinuation was clear. Kane wasn't just gossiping. He was planting seeds of doubt, testing her allegiance. She realized he saw Soren's grief not as a tragedy, but as a vulnerability to be exploited. And he was trying to figure out if she could be his crowbar to pry it open. "Mr. Blackwood's affairs are his own," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Now, if you're not buying anything, Sheriff, I have work to do." Kane's smile tightened, his eyes glinting with annoyance. He tipped his hat and sauntered out, but Arya felt his predatory gaze on her long after he was gone. A fragile alliance had been formed not between her and Soren, but between her and the quiet dignity of survival. She had a job, a roof over her head, and the respect of a good man like Mr. Abernathy. But she was also now a piece on a board she was only just beginning to understand, standing in the shadow of two powerful opposing forces: a rich man broken by his past, and a corrupt sheriff determined to seize his future. And she was caught directly in the middle. The first accident happened 2 weeks later. One of Soren Blackwood's ranch hands, a young man named Billy, rode into town with his arm in a sling, and a story that sent a nervous tremor through the community. A whole section of fence on the northern pasture had been cut during the night, and a dozen prize head of cattle had wandered off, likely into the treacherous terrain of the Crying Woman Canyon. Billy had taken a fall when his horse stumbled into a deliberately placed hole while searching for them. In the general store, the talk was immediate and speculative. "It's Phineas Cobb," one man declared. "He's always had it in for Blackwood." "Could be rustlers from the south," offered another. "Heard they've been getting bolder." Arya listened quietly as she weighed out coffee beans. But she had seen Sheriff Kane and his 2 brutish deputies, the Tucker brothers, riding out towards the Blackwood property early that morning, long before Billy had arrived in town. They had returned just before noon, their horses lathered and their faces smug. It could have been a coincidence, But the unease that had settled in her gut since her first conversation with the sheriff told her otherwise. Kane conducted a perfunctory investigation, riding out to Cobb's ranch and asking a few loud questions that served only to inflame the animosity between the two ranchers. He pronounced the incident the work of common rustlers and declared the case closed, a statement that satisfied no one and only deepened the sense of simmering conflict. Soren became even more withdrawn. When he came into the store now, the lines of stress around his eyes were deeper, his temper shorter. He still refused to acknowledge Arya directly, but she noticed him watching her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking. His gaze wasn't hostile anymore. It was something more complex, guarded, curious, and perhaps infinitesimally grateful for her silence on the matter of his public cruelty toward her. Arya's own life had found a precarious balance. She treasured her conversations with Mr. Abernathy, who had become a father figure to her. She even found a strange comfort in the predictability of small-town life. But the shadow of Sheriff Kane was a constant presence. He continued his visits to the store, his attempts at charm becoming more insistent. "A woman like you is wasted stocking shelves, Arya," he'd say, leaning close, his breath smelling of whiskey and false promises. Redemption. Gulch has more to offer. I have more to offer. I am content. Sheriff, she would reply, stepping back to create a space he was always trying to invade. One evening he went further. He waited until Mr. Abernathy had gone home for the night, and she was locking up. He cornered her on the boardwalk, his bulk blocking her path. "I know things are hard for you," he said, his voice a low, conspiratorial purr. "But you're smart. You see things. Blackwood's losing his grip. His grief is making him sloppy. A man like that can be a danger to the whole territory. But if a person were to help me keep an eye on him, let me know if he starts doing anything crazy. I could make it worth their while. Ensure they had a comfortable future here." The offer was laid bare. Be his spy. The implication was chilling. He wasn't trying to protect the town from Soren. He was building a case against him, manufacturing a narrative of instability to justify whatever move he was planning. "I'm not a spy," Sheriff Arya said, her voice colder than a winter wind. "And Mr. Blackwood's only danger seems to be from his so-called neighbors. Now, if you'll excuse me." She tried to push past him, but he grabbed her arm. His grip was like iron. "Don't be a fool. You have no one. I'm offering you a side. You should think carefully before you choose the losing one." Fear, sharp and metallic, flooded her senses, but it was quickly overtaken by a surge of anger. She looked down at his hand on her arm, and then back up at his face, her eyes blazing. "Take your hand off me!" Her voice was not loud, but it held a core of steel he hadn't expected. For a second he looked genuinely surprised. Then his lips curled into a sneer. He released her, but not before giving her arm a final, painful squeeze. "Your choice," he said, and walked away into the twilight. Shaken, Arya hurried up to her room, her mind racing. Kane's actions confirmed her darkest suspicions. The cut fences, the stolen cattle, it was all part of his design. He was systematically targeting Soren, creating an illusion of chaos and incompetence around him. The next incident was worse. A small fire broke out in one of Soren's outlying barns, destroying a winter's supply of hay. The official explanation was a stray spark from a lantern. But the day before, Arya had seen the Tucker brothers buying an unusual amount of kerosene at the store, claiming it was for their lamps. This time, Soren came to town himself to report it to the sheriff. Arya watched the exchange from the store window. She saw Soren, his face a mask of barely controlled fury, gesturing angrily towards his ranch. She saw Sheriff Kane, his expression a perfect pantomime of grave concern, nodding and patting Soren on the shoulder. It was a sickening performance. Later that day, Soren came into the store. He looked defeated, the fight seemingly gone out of him. He walked straight to the counter, where Arya was arranging a display of canned peaches. He stood before her for a long moment, saying nothing. Then finally he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "You were right about the molasses." The bizarre, out-of-context statement took her by surprise. I'm glad you liked it." He shook his head, his gaze fixed on the wooden counter. "No, I mean, that day. You told me about the molasses. You just stated a fact. You didn't cower. You didn't flatter me. You just were." He finally looked up, and she saw the raw pain in his eyes. Everyone else, they either walk on eggshells around me, or they look at me with pity. Kane looks at me like a vulture circling a dying animal. But you look at me like I'm just a man. It was the most vulnerable he had ever been, a crack in the fortress of his grief. "You are just a man, Mr. Blackwood," she said softly. "A man who has suffered a great deal. But that doesn't make you invisible." He seemed to search her face, looking for the lie, the angle, the hidden motive. He found none. The fire at the hay barn. It wasn't an accident. "I know," she said. His eyes widened in surprise. "How I see things," she replied, echoing the sheriff's own words back at him. "I see who comes and goes. I see who buys kerosene when they have no need for it. And I see a sheriff who is more interested in watching you fail than in finding the truth." A silent understanding passed between them, as clear and profound as any spoken pact. He saw that she was not just the rejected woman from the stagecoach, but a shrewd and observant ally. And she saw that he was beginning to trust her, a feat no one else in Redemption Gulch had managed in 2 years. "Be careful," Miss Wren Soren said, his voice low. "Jedediah Kane is a snake, and now that he's seen us talking, he'll consider you a threat." "I'm already on his bad side," she admitted. "He doesn't like being told no." A grim, humorless smile touched Soren's lips for the first time. "No, I don't suppose he does." He paused, then added, "Thank you." He bought a bag of nails and left. But the atmosphere had changed. It was no longer her versus him. It was now unspoken, but understood, the two of them against the insidious, encroaching shadow of the sheriff. And in the dangerous world of Redemption Gulch, that fragile alliance was the only shield they had. Just as the tentative shoots of trust were beginning to break ground between Arya and Soren, the afternoon stagecoach delivered a ghost. She was a vision of Eastern elegance and sophistication, stepping onto the dusty street as if it were a red carpet. Dressed in a traveling suit of deep emerald silk, with a matching hat adorned with a single perfect feather, she was everything Arya was not. Her name was Isabelle Dubois, and the older townsfolk remembered her well. She was the daughter of a failed prospector, who had been Soren's first and only love before his marriage to Sarah. Isabelle, ambitious and beautiful, had broken Soren's young heart, leaving Redemption Gulch for a wealthy industrialist in Philadelphia. Now she was back a widow, her return timed with uncanny precision to the news of her first love's immense prosperity. Isabelle's gaze swept the town, a look of faint disdain on her perfectly painted lips, until it landed on the Triple B brand on a nearby wagon. A slow, confident smile spread across her face. She had come to reclaim what she now saw as her rightful property. Her first move was to re-establish herself in the town's social hierarchy, a position she assumed with effortless grace. Her second was to present herself at the Blackwood Ranch. Soren was shocked to see her. The sight of Isabel, a living relic from a life before the fire, was a disorienting jolt. She was a reminder of a time when his heart was whole before it had been shattered and then cauterized by grief. "Soren, darling," she cooed, taking his rough hands in her gloved ones. "I heard about your unspeakable loss. My heart broke for you all the way in Philadelphia. When my own dear husband passed, I knew I had to come home. To the only place that ever felt real. To you." Her performance was flawless. She spoke of shared memories of youthful dreams and of a destiny she claimed was always meant to be theirs. Soren, emotionally vulnerable and starved for any connection to his past, was caught off guard. He didn't love her, that part of him had died with Sarah, but she was a familiar face in a world that had become alien and hostile. He allowed her to stay for dinner. News of Isabel's return and her visit to the ranch spread through Redemption Gulch like wildfire. At the general store, Arya heard the whispers. "She's come back for his money," Maeve, the saloon owner, declared to Mr. Abernathy. "She didn't want him when he was a boy with dirt under his nails, but now that he's the cattle king, she's back like a fly to honey." Arya felt a pang of something she refused to name. It wasn't jealousy, she told herself. It was concern. She had seen the predatory glint in Isabel's eyes when she'd first surveyed the town. It was the same look she saw in Sheriff Kane's. Her fears were confirmed when Isabel made a grand entrance into the store a few days later, ostensibly to purchase some French soap, but really to inspect the competition. She appraised Arya from head to toe, her smile thin and condescending. "So you're the little charity case I've been hearing about," Isabel said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "The mail-order bride. How dreadfully embarrassing for you." "I'm the store clerk," Arya replied evenly, refusing to be baited. "Can I help you find something?" "I doubt it." Isabel sniffed. "I just wanted to see the woman who threw herself at Soren in the middle of the street. You have more courage than sense, I'll give you that. But a word of advice, dear. Soren and I have a history you could never understand. He's a complicated man. He needs a woman of substance and experience, not a desperate girl playing shopkeeper. Know your place." The venom in her words was potent. Arya saw her for what she was, a beautifully packaged viper. Isabel wasn't just a rival for Soren's affection. She was a threat to the fragile alliance Arya and Soren had begun to form. Isabel's goal was to isolate Soren, to wrap him in a cocoon of shared nostalgia, and convince him she was the only one who could possibly understand his pain. Her next move was to align herself with the other power in town. She arranged a meeting with Sheriff Kane. Arya watched from her window as they sat at a table outside the saloon, their heads bent close together, a pair of spiders spinning a web. Isabel, with her intimate knowledge of a younger, more impressionable Soren, and Kane, with his corrupt authority and brute force, were a formidable combination. The atmosphere in town grew heavier, more oppressive. The accidents at Soren's ranch stopped, but they were replaced by something more insidious. Rumors. Whispers started by Kane and fanned by Isabel. That Soren was drinking heavily. That he was seen wandering the hills at night talking to himself. That the grief had finally cracked his mind, and he was becoming a danger. Soren, confused by Isabel's reappearance and worn down by Kane's campaign of sabotage, began to retreat further into himself. He spoke to Arya less, his eyes clouded with suspicion and old pain. Isabel was constantly at his side, whispering in his ear, poisoning him against the one person who had offered him genuine, unvarnished support. One afternoon, Soren came into the store. Isabel was with him, her hand possessively on his arm. She had steered him inside on the pretense of buying new gloves for him. "Arya, dear," Isabel said, her voice cloying. "Soren was just telling me how kind Mr. Abernathy has been to you. It's so wonderful that this town looks after its unfortunates." Soren looked deeply uncomfortable. He wouldn't meet Arya's eyes. Arya ignored Isabel and spoke directly to him. "The fence on the south ridge is vulnerable, Mr. Blackwood. The rain last week caused a washout. Anyone could get through." She had overheard some ranchers talking about it and knew he needed to be warned. It was a simple statement of fact, an offering of loyalty. Before Soren could respond, Isabel laughed a tinkling, unpleasant sound. "Oh, honestly, don't trouble him with such trivialities. He has people for that. You're a shop girl, not a ranch foreman." She turned to Soren, her voice softening. "Darling, let's go. This place smells of dust and desperation." She pulled him toward the door. At the last moment, Soren looked back at Arya, his expression torn. He saw the clear, honest warning in her eyes, and then he saw the beautifully painted mask of his past pulling him away. He hesitated, a silent battle waging within him. Then, with a resigned sigh, he turned and walked out with Isabel, leaving Arya standing in the quiet store, the smell of French soap and betrayal hanging in the air. The ghost from the past had won the round. She had successfully rebuilt the wall around Soren's heart, and this time Arya feared it might be impenetrable. The web was being drawn tighter, and she was beginning to fear what would happen when Kane and Isabel decided they no longer had any use for the fly. The alliance between Isabel Dubois and Sheriff Jedediah Kane curdled the very air in Redemption Gulch. It was a partnership born of pure avarice. Isabel wanted Soren's name and fortune, and Kane wanted his land. Their plan was as simple as it was diabolical. They would not just ruin Soren Blackwood, they would erase him. The new strategy was to frame him for a crime so heinous that the territorial government would have no choice but to intervene, seizing his assets and declaring him unfit. Phineas Cobb, the bitter rival rancher, was their unwitting pawn. One night, under the cover of a new moon, Kane's deputies, the Tucker brothers, rode out to Cobb's ranch. They didn't just cut fences. They drove off nearly half of Cobb's herd, and as a final brutal touch, set fire to his main barn. But they were careful. Using a fast-burning accelerant, they ensured the barn would be a total loss, and they left behind a single damning piece of evidence, a custom-made branding iron, stolen from the Triple B Forge weeks earlier. The next morning, a distraught Phineas Cobb rode into town, rallying the populace with a tale of Blackwood's madness and vengeance. Sheriff Kane put on a masterful show of shock and resolve, forming a posse on the spot. "No man is above the law," he thundered from the steps of his office. Not even Soren Blackwood Arya heard the news with a cold, sickening dread. She knew with absolute certainty that this was Kane's doing. While the town was in an uproar, she slipped out the back of the store. She had to warn Soren. She didn't take the main road, but cut through the woods, her heart pounding with a desperate urgency. She arrived at the Triple B to find it strangely quiet. The ranch hands were gone, likely drawn into town by the commotion. She found Soren in the smithy, his face grim, working the bellows, as if trying to force his anger and frustration into a piece of glowing metal. "They're coming for you," she said, breathless. "They've burned Cobb's barn and planted one of your branding irons. Kane has a posse." Soren slammed his hammer down on the anvil, the clang echoing the rage in his eyes. "That son of a viper! I knew he was building to something." He looked at her, his earlier confusion and suspicion burned away by the clear and present danger. He saw her not as a nuisance or a complication, but as the only person who had been telling him the truth all along. He's been working with Isabel. She told him where to find the old forge where that iron was stored. The betrayal hit him with the force of a physical blow. "I need to hide the ranch's ledgers," he said, his mind racing. "They're in the main house. They show all my dealings, every head of cattle bought and sold. They'll prove I haven't been selling off any of Cobb's stock." "Go," she urged. "I'll slow them down if I can." But it was too late. As Soren ran for the house, the posse led by Kane and a triumphant-looking Cobb rode into the ranch yard. Isabel was with them, perched on a fine mare, her face a mask of sorrowful concern. "There he is," Kane shouted, pointing at Soren. The arsonist. Before Soren could reach the house, the Tucker brothers cut him off, their rifles leveled. "Don't move, Blackwood." Kane dismounted, a smug smile on his face. Soren, I warned you your grief would get the better of you, attacking your neighbors, burning their property. It's a sad day. You framed me." "Kane." Soren snarled, his hands clenched into fists. "Now why would I do that?" Kane asked with mock innocence. He turned to Arya. "And you, always in the way. It seems you've chosen the losing side after all." He nodded to his deputies. "Lock her in the tack room. She's an accomplice." One of the Tucker brothers grabbed Arya, his grip bruising. She struggled, but he was too strong. Shoving her into the small dark room and bolting the door. She was plunged into darkness, the smell of leather and sweat filling her lungs. She could hear Kane's voice, loud and commanding, as he directed his men to search the ranch house for more evidence. Trapped in the dark, Arya's mind raced. The ledgers. If Kane found them, he would destroy them. She had to get out. Frantically, her hands searched the rough wooden walls until she found what she was looking for. A small, high window barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. It was boarded up from the outside. Using a loose pry bar, she found on the floor. She began to work on the bolt, her knuckles scraping and bleeding in the dark. Outside, the situation was escalating. Kane, unable to find the ledgers, was growing frustrated. He needed to solidify his narrative. He looked at the main ranch house, the home where Soren had lived with Sarah and Daniel, the home where his life had ended. An evil, opportunistic idea formed in Kane's mind. "He's gone mad," Kane yelled to the posse. "He's probably got the whole house rigged to blow. For the safety of the territory, we have to smoke him out." He looked at Isabel. "A tragedy," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "Another fire. It seems poor Soren is just drawn to flames. When this is over, the territorial court will be happy to hand over management of this ranch to a more stable party. Someone he once trusted. Someone like you." Isabel's eyes widened, but she didn't object. She was in too deep. Kane gave the signal. One of his men tossed a lit torch onto the dry timber of the porch. The flames caught instantly, licking up the walls with a hungry roar. The sight of the fire, the smell of the smoke, it broke through Soren's rage and hit him with the force of a physical memory. He was transported back 2 years to the night he had lost everything. The screams, the heat, the suffocating helplessness. He let out a primal roar of agony, a sound that was not human. His mind shattered. The posse members. Simple ranchers who had been swept up in the moment looked on in horror. This wasn't justice. It was an execution. My God, Cain. What are you doing? Cobb asked, his face pale. Securing the peace, Cain retorted. At that moment, from the side of the burning house, a figure appeared covered in soot, her dress torn. It was Arya. She had finally broken the boards on the tack room window and scrambled out just as the flames had begun to spread. Soren, his mind lost in the nightmare of the past, saw her through the haze of smoke and fire. In his broken state, he didn't see Arya Wren, the store clerk. He saw Sarah, his wife trapped in the inferno, reaching for him. Sarah. He screamed a name no one had heard him utter in 2 years. The spell of his grief-stricken paralysis broke, replaced by a surge of pure protective adrenaline. He was no longer a victim. He was a husband, a father fighting to save his family. He charged forward, straight at the deputies, blocking his path, tossing them aside like dolls. He was a man possessed, driven by a love so powerful it transcended time and sanity. He ran toward the flames, toward the woman he believed was his wife. His only thought to pull her from the fire that had stolen his life once before. Arya watched him come, her heart breaking for him, realizing that in his madness he was trying to rewrite the most tragic chapter of his life. And she was standing right in the middle of it. The whole village wasn't just watching a fire. They were watching a man's soul being burned to the ground for a second time. As Soren Blackwood charged toward the inferno, fueled by a love resurrected from the ashes of memory, the dynamic of the entire confrontation shifted. The members of the posse who had been swept up in Cain's righteous crusade now saw the scene for what it was, the cruel tormenting of a grief-stricken man. This wasn't law. It was a lynching. Arya, standing at the edge of the porch as Soren ran toward her, screaming his dead wife's name, had only a second to act. If he plunged into the burning house after her, he would die. Soren! It's me! It's Arya! She screamed, her voice cutting through the roar of the flames and the fog of his delusion. Her voice, clear and real, pierced through his hallucination. He stopped short, just feet from the flames, his chest heaving. The wild, haunted look in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a dawning, horrified recognition. He saw her Arya covered in soot, her face etched with terror and concern for him. He saw the burning house, a horrific echo of his past. And he saw Sheriff Cain, his face a mask of triumphant evil. The pieces of his fractured mind slammed back into place with painful clarity. This fire was not a memory. It was a new nightmare orchestrated by the man who was supposed to uphold the law. Cain Soren's voice was no longer a scream of agony, but a low, dangerous roar of pure rage. At that exact moment, Mr. Abernathy, having heard the commotion from town, arrived in his wagon, his old shotgun held with shaking but determined hands. He was not alone. Several other townsmen who had grown suspicious of Cain's methods and respected Soren were with him. That's enough. Jedediah Abernathy yelled, his voice cracking with age and anger. This has gone far enough. Cain, seeing the tide turning against him, knew his plan was falling apart. He drew his Colt. This man is a dangerous criminal. Stay back. But Arya made her move. While all eyes were on the standoff, she slipped past Soren and ran not away from the danger, but straight toward Isabelle Dubois, who was watching the chaos unfold, her face pale with fear. Before Isabel could react, Arya reached up and snatched the woman's expensive reticule from her saddle. "What are you doing?" Isabel shrieked. Arya ignored her. She opened the clasp and turned it upside down. Out onto the dusty ground tumbled a handkerchief, a small mirror, and a folded piece of paper. It was a letter. Arya grabbed it and held it high. "This is a letter from Sheriff Kane to Isabel Dubois," Arya announced, her voice ringing across the yard. "I saw him give it to her in town. It details their plan to seize the Triple B ranch." She had no idea if that's what the letter said. It was a desperate bluff, but the look of pure terror on both Kane's and Isabel's faces was all the confirmation anyone needed. Kane panicked. He fired his gun not at Soren, but at Arya. Soren moved with a speed no one thought possible. He threw himself in front of Arya, taking the bullet in his shoulder. He grunted in pain, but didn't fall. The impact spun him around, but his eyes never left Kane's. The gunshot broke the spell. The posse members turned on Kane, their own guns drawn. "Drop it, Sheriff!" "It's over!" Phineas Cobb shouted, his face filled with shame and fury at having been so easily manipulated. The Tucker brothers, seeing their master's downfall, threw down their weapons and surrendered. Kane, trapped and exposed, made a final desperate move. He grabbed Isabel, pulling her from her horse and holding her as a human shield, pressing the barrel of his gun to her head. "Let me go, or she dies!" he screamed. Isabel, who had orchestrated this whole affair with cold ambition, was now just a terrified woman, weeping and pleading for her life. The illusion of her power and sophistication was shattered, leaving only a pathetic, grasping coward. Soren, clutching his bleeding shoulder, began to walk slowly toward them. "Let her go, Kane. It's me you want. Stay back, Blackwood." But as Kane's attention was fixed on Soren, he failed to notice Mr. Abernathy circling around him. With a sudden, swift movement, the old storekeeper swung the butt of his shotgun, connecting solidly with the back of Kane's head. The sheriff crumpled to the ground, unconscious. It was over. Silence fell over the ranch yard, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Isabel's terrified sobs. The townsfolk stared at the scene, the full weight of what had happened settling upon them. They saw the burning house, a monument to one man's enduring grief. They saw Soren wounded, but standing tall, his eyes finally clear. They saw their corrupt sheriff defeated in the dust, and they saw Arya, the rejected mail-order bride, who had shown more courage and integrity than any of them. And that is when the tears began to fall. They were not just for the drama of the moment. The women wept for the profound tragedy that had haunted Soren Blackwood, a pain they now understood so much more deeply. The men wept with shame for their part in the posse, for being so easily led astray by a wicked man. They wept for the years they had lived in fear of Kane, and for the sudden cleansing relief of his downfall. They were tears of sorrow, of shame, and ultimately of redemption. Soren walked over to Arya, ignoring his wound, ignoring the chaos. He stopped in front of her, his gaze full of a profound emotion that went beyond gratitude. He looked at the smoldering remains of his house, the last physical tie to his old life now turning to ash. It was a funeral pyre, not just for a building, but for the ghost of his grief. "You saved me," he said, his voice thick. "Not from the fire, not from Kane. You saved me from myself." Arya looked up at him, her own tears tracing paths through the soot on her face. You looked so alone, she whispered, echoing the words she had spoken on the day they first met. This time, he didn't recoil. He reached out with his good arm and pulled her into an embrace. It wasn't the impulsive, desperate hug of their first meeting. This was a deliberate, powerful hold, an anchor in a storm. He held her as the town watched, and this time there were no whispers, only a shared silent understanding. A life had been lost in a fire here once, but today, a new one had just begun. In the end, it wasn't the fire or the gunshot that truly shook the village of Redemption Gulch. It was the raw, undeniable power of a love that refused to be extinguished. Arya and Soren. Two souls shattered by life found in each other, the missing pieces to become whole again. Their story is a powerful reminder that even in the harshest of circumstances, after the most painful rejection, courage and compassion can unearth a love so profound it can bring an entire community to its knees, washing away years of darkness with tears of redemption. If their incredible journey from rejection to redemption moved you, please don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who loves a story of hope, and make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next unforgettable tale.